In the last section, we talked about populations and sampling. In this section, we're going to look at bad sampling methods. There are a lot of different ways to choose a sample of a population, and some types of sample lead to results that are not reliable. So the first unreliable sample type is called a convenience sample. A convenience sample is a sample of individuals who are selected because they are members of a population who are easy to reach, and they are usually not representative of the population. So suppose you want to find the average height of adult males for a statistics project, and you decide to ask the men in your family how tall they are because that's convenient for you. Well, this could be a problem because the men in your family could be genetically predisposed to be taller or shorter, so this would not be a good representative sample of the population. Another example of a convenience sample is this one. This one's not quite as obvious. Going to the mall and standing by a particular entrance and surveying as many of the people walking through that entrance as you can seems like a fast, convenient way of finding out Americans' opinions. But it turns out that this is actually not a good way to find a representative sample, and let's look at why that is. Well, first of all, people at malls tend to be more prosperous than typical Americans. So if you're stopping people at the mall, they would tend to be in a higher income bracket than people in general. They're also more likely to be teenagers or retired, so you're getting more younger and older people and not as many people in the middle age spectrum. The kind of stores near the entrance you are standing by could influence who uses that entrance. So if you're standing next to a store that sells tools and paint, maybe like a Sears, then you could be more likely to get people who are doing home improvement projects. Whereas if you stand by a department store like JCPenney or a Macy's, then you'd be more likely probably to get women who are out shopping for clothes, maybe. Finally, the person giving the survey may avoid asking people who look unfriendly or unapproachable. So that leads into our next definition of bias. The design of a statistical study has bias if it systematically favors certain outcomes. So even though the person who is giving the survey at the mall doesn't know it, they may avoid asking certain types of people because they're not as comfortable with them. Let's look at another example of online polls. The American Family Association often posts online poll questions on its website. Because the respondents are people who visit this site, the poll results almost always support AFA's positions. So the visitors to the website are conservative, and we expect to see a conservative bias in their polls. A recent poll asks about legalization of same-sex marriage. Since the AFA is a conservative group, it would be expected that the respondents would oppose legalizing same-sex marriage. But what happened in this case is that email lists and social network sites favored by young liberals started pointing their followers to the AFA poll. So in the end, almost 850,000 people responded to the poll, and 60% of them favored legalizing same-sex marriage. So we expected a conservative bias here, but because of the publicity that the poll got on liberal websites, more people on both sides of the issue ended up responding to the poll. Finally, we're going to talk about one last thing called voluntary response sample. And what we saw in the last example was actually a voluntary response sample. And that is a sample that consists of people who choose themselves by responding to a general appeal. And these types of samples are biased because people with strong opinions are more likely to respond and will therefore be overrepresented in the sample. So in the example of the online poll, the poll was publicized probably by both liberal websites and then also in response to that by conservative websites. And the people who felt most strongly on both sides were those that ended up answering the poll. So things you should know for this section. You should know the definitions of a convenience sample, of bias, and of a voluntary response sample. And you should be able to identify if a sample has any of these problems.